Welcome to the November iteration of the Cannabis Coaching Institute Book Club. We are so glad that you're here, and we're so excited to be joined by one of the co-authors of this month's book. We don't want to do too much preamble, but Corinne and I do want to introduce ourselves. I'm Andrea Maharg. I am a cannabis educator and a longtime teacher as well. And I'm the head cannabis science educator over at the Cannabis Coaching Institute, which was founded and created by the wonderful Corinne Tobias. Corinne, you want to come on and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Corinne Tobias. I'm the founder of Wake and Bake and the Cannabis Coaching Institute. I'm so excited that we get to do these public, free, live events with all of you. Thank you all for being here. This is all, part of the mission of getting cannabis back inside of the medicine cabinet and for creating a more just and fair cannabis industry as we continue to move forward. And so we're so excited to have the co-author of the book Waiting to Inhale here.
The reason we're having book club this time around is because we love doing this at CCI, but also I love reading cannabis books. And Corinne was like, you know what, just take it and run. So I got to choose all my favorites this season. And I've always, for a long time, felt like as soon as people understand the science of cannabis, they're going to let go of their stigma and they're going to consider it to be a possible plant medicine for themselves. But it wasn't until I started myself at the Cannabis Coaching Institute and started reading about the history of cannabis prohibition and realizing just like the pure lies and the super racist roots of cannabis prohibition in Canada and the States, that kind of like made the puzzle complete for me, where I was like, oh, you're telling me that this works in our body and can help with so many things. And I've been lied to about this for so long. And the reason I was lied to is because you're a racist. Yeah. So when I got the opportunity to check out Tahira's new book, I was very excited. And then we asked her if she would come on here and talk to us. So we're really excited for this conversation. Tahira, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us what was your story into writing this book? How did you get here to be the author of this book?
Absolutely. And thanks everybody for joining tonight, and Andrea and Kern for having me on here. It's awesome, and excited that people are that this group exists. So thank you too for collaborating and bringing this to life. So my story is started in 2013. I my family is Pakistani. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio. Cannabis was nowhere on my radar other than it was around me, growing up in a small town. I'm a child of the 80s, so Nancy Reagan Just Say No was very much my view of everything. Consumed when I was in high school, but it really wasn't a part of my life as an adult. And in 2013, I was in business school, second year of business school, and my mother's father, was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. At the time, he was living with my parents in Ohio when he got his diagnosis. So my mom really jumped into that caregiver role, and pretty quickly started looking at alternatives to chemotherapy and just alternative medicines. My family is very active in homeopathic medicine, and so natural medicine has been a big part of my life. My dad is a physician as well, but we were never the ones who got prescription medications. We were always the one who got something homeopathic. Still, cannabis was not something that was necessarily on their radar because it was this taboo topic. We were all taught the same thing. My parents immigrated to the US in the late 70s, so very much in that, they were part of that cycle of all the negative talks that was happening around cannabis, even though in their home country of Pakistan it kind of grows freely and nobody pays any attention to it. So when my grandfather got sick, it was really became a bit of a research project for me, and it started with my mother of all people, although she does not like to take credit for being the one to really introduce me to cannabis in my life. But it started with a text from her to me and my younger sister, and all she said was, "Do you know where to get marijuana?" To which my younger sister immediately called me and she said, "Do you think that this is a test?" And I was like, "I don't know what mom is up to right now, but I feel like we're both probably too old for this. So let's find out what's going on." And it turned out that my mom, late night Google searches, just going down the rabbit hole, kept coming across cannabis as something that might be helpful for my grandfather as he was going through chemotherapy. again, it was 2013. Cannabis was not available in any legal form in the state of Ohio and in most states in the country. And for me, it really just became this research project trying to understand more about what was it about cannabis. What were the stories out there? There obviously wasn't a lot of data, but there was definitely a lot of information around how it had helped people who had been impacted by cancer and other illnesses, and just more daily use. And it was eye-opening for me, and it was really something you had to go find it. At that time the information still didn't really exist in the way that it does today. And what I really was shocked by was the history of it. And really had to kind of dig for that as well. But then once I learned so much more about the war on drugs, how it came to be, how cannabis was actually legal at a point in time in the US, and then kind of why it started shifting, not only here but other parts of the country or other parts of the world, I really was just kind of enraged and did not know what was happening at that time, particularly in the US, around states just starting to legalize. Colorado and Washington were just starting to pass policy at that time, and was just really fortunate to be at the right place at the right time when I was graduating from business school. One of the companies that had started in the U.S. based out of Seattle was a company called Privateer Holdings. They started off as more of a private equity firm, became much more of a holding company. They're the company that incubated Tilray essentially, and also businesses like Leafly, and a couple of other businesses that you might know, but Tilray being the largest one. And so I ended up joining them after business school as, one of very early employee, and figured that it could either be a really interesting adventure that maybe leads nowhere, or it could be the start of an industry that I really wanted to be a part of to help people get access to something that I felt like everybody should have access to. And unfortunately for us, we weren't able to get anything for my grandfather, and he ended up passing away within 6 months. Chemotherapy was really challenging for him, and I think truly shaved time off of his life rather than the other side of it. And from there, it's just my point of view was just that this was something that needed to be out there. So progressing, this was 2014 when I joined the industry. Just jumping forward, Akwasi and I met each other in maybe it's 2017, 2018. It's all kind of fuzzy at this point, but we met at a conference and realized very quickly after each of us spoke that we just had a lot in common, not realizing that, I was one of maybe 2 or 3 people who were like business people at this conference at McGill, and everybody else was much more on the research side. And so was not expecting to have so much in common with someone, but really what we were talking about were the two different sides of race in cannabis, and how the war on drugs has really ruined both countries in a way. And as legalization was rolling out in both, that the social equity side, or the focus on these populations that had really been marginalized and harmed by prohibition, were not being focused on. And so Akwasi is more of the data, the scientist, the sociologist, and he's a criminologist and has spent a lot of his time researching race and crime in North America, and then me on the business side, really experiencing it kind of firsthand on what is actually happening within businesses, who's getting licenses, how is this actually coming to light, and what does it even mean to have social equity. So we ended up kind of being in the conference circuit together, and what started off as a project for Akwasi, where he wanted to write a book and asked me to write a chapter, over time kind of became this joint effort. And we ended up writing the whole thing during COVID. So we realized that, we'd met, it's a good thing that we met each other, and then we're starting on the project kind of late 2019, early 2020, and then realized that we weren't going to see each other for what turned out to be 3 years. So we went through kind of the whole process together through that. And it took a lot of different forms. And to be honest, for a long time, nobody was interested, because it just didn't seem like a topic that any publisher really wanted to talk about. And then George Floyd happened here in the US, COVID hit, there was an acceleration, I think, in highlighting race inequalities. And not that they haven't been highlighted in the past, but it was just a particular moment in time where the focus was really starting to take hold. And if you guys remember that period of time, there was just kind of like one after the other, and people were fed up. And then finally publishers started paying attention. And we were fortunate enough to work with MIT, who took very much an academic point of view on wanting to take a pretty dense and heavy topic and put it out there for a non-cannabis audience, for people who should know about what is happening, not just those of us who are interested in cannabis and are consumers or work on the business side, but really writing it in a way that was for your average person to understand, because it's so important to know about this, because it has impacted so much in both countries, both as policy has evolved, of how communities are impacted, how budgets are made. I mean, there's just so much, and the topic is so big that we had to try to figure out a way to trim it down into 200 pages. But we were hoping that it was a start, at least a conversation starter, to get people to at least pay more attention and hopefully have the dialogue.
Thank you so much for that. It's like, you know better, and then you're able to do better because we understand where this is coming from. I love the way that the book was laid out. And I agree, you could come at this book not knowing anything about cannabis, or and just walk in blind and have a real deep understanding of where we're at in 2023. You document how various states and countries around the world, mostly in the States, are legalizing, all doing it extremely differently. When I started working in the cannabis industry, I wanted immediate federal legalization of cannabis in the States. Like, it would make, I just thought it would make total sense and make my life easier. And I'm so glad that she's here. Takesha Carter is one of our superstar grads, and she introduced this perspective to me of liberation before legalization. Like, why are we doing this backwards? So after studying this for so long, have you seen legalization done well anywhere? Or what would your ideal path towards legalization be, keeping in mind this racial, social equity perspective at the top?
The very short answer is no. I haven't seen anybody do it well. I think there have been evolutions, and that's the expected reality. We've created so much terrible policy, I think, in both countries, and particularly for the U.S., I blame for helping other countries or influencing other countries to also create terrible policy. So even the extension of cannabis now, as we look at what has happened in psychedelics and the kind of the emergence now, that the reality is that things like LSD were legal at a point in time, and in the hands of scientists and practitioners to be able to study them in order to have better information about them to then base regulations on. But the US kind of forced everybody to pull it out of the market and go into a dark period. And so now we're kind of starting again, and things had to develop in the shadows. So as it is with cannabis, so much developed underground in the shadows without that information, without the trust that we need. And so we're fighting against something that was inherently created by the government and saying, like, this is bad, this isn't helpful. Where is the information? It's like, well, you make it really hard to study in the US in particular, right? It's not federally legal, so you have to go through very specific channels to get your hands on cannabis that's grown in one university in the country in order to be able to study it. And so I think that that there's so many different elements of this that have to be handled. So I don't expect policy or regulation on a first try to roll out well. It's just the unfortunate reality, because if we look at the population today, we've all lived under this view that cannabis is illegal, cannabis is bad for you, cannabis is associated with a very specific audiences, and it unfortunately takes a long time to pull it away from that. Cannabis has influenced policing for so long, right, as a way to enter people's homes, as an excuse. And we give some examples of this in the book, of like real stories of people who were caught with the equivalent of $20 of cannabis, a pound, something like that. Things today that are actually completely legal, but then what gets added on to those are gun charges or other types of charges in order to amplify sentences. And so the extraction of all of that has been really, really challenging. I'm still very hopeful. I sit in New York. We were so hopeful 2 years ago when policy finally passed, and we're proud that it has this strong focus on social equity, and it is a complete disaster. We have more illegal, by 100 times more illegal dispensaries and stores than we do legal. All the social equity applicants who really were supposed to be given that opportunity to charge ahead before everybody and have the opportunity to put their stake in the ground and be successful are, how many of them actually will be able to get there is a big question mark. And I think that the intention was good, but what I'm disappointed in is that every state, and this is specific to the US, every state that legalizes for some reason thinks that they're going to be able to do it better than just learning from all the ones that are out there already, and like take all the good and the bad and then understand and actually get, now we have the benefit of having people who've potentially been in the industry for 5 to 10 years, who've seen how some of these markets have rolled out. So from the business side, having that voice at the table, I think is critical at the government level. And I think New York is completely lacking that. And that's just like one example. And sometimes I get frustrated that I'm like, well, why didn't I raise my hand back then to join that council? It's also because, it's very political, and it's very, they're government people who are working in it, and that's a very specific path. But it shouldn't be that way to be able to roll this out. And then to say that you're going to take the same path, like it's going to be like alcohol. Well, it's not like alcohol. It's going to be like tobacco. Well, it shouldn't be that way either. And so I think the challenge of kind of parsing out what are the cannabis, to me, is like this umbrella industry that has all of these other industries within it. And that becomes the challenge, because you get lobbying, you get capital, it's too many things that are trying to compete with each other. Again, I think we look 10, 20 years down the path, it'll look very different. Even if in the US it is still state by state, I think it will look very different, and there'll be an element of unification that does happen across the country. But the unfortunate reality is that right now, as it sits in the US, if you federally legalize it, then a lot of powerful entities who have control in certain areas are then potentially challenged by much larger operators, Fortune 500 companies. And so incentives kind of get misaligned in different ways, even though that would allow for mass expungement of records and, a lot of people who are probably sitting in jail right now to be released en masse, which is the biggest challenge that we've been facing, is that, people are still, tens of thousands of people are still sitting in jail in the US for things that are actually not even a crime anymore, and maybe not even like a misdemeanor. And so that conflict is still really challenging to parse apart. And that was part of the hope with the book too, is to just get more people understanding all the pieces that are really critical to be able to drive some of these, the social equity side forward, and then also have the business element be successful. Because right now a lot of businesses are struggling because our taxes are too high, or you have a rule like 280E in the US where you can't deduct normal business expenses.
That's a lot. I was hoping
Sorry.
you'd be like,
sorry.
no, I mean, like, I was hoping you'd be like, yeah, I have this plan in my head, and if states follow this, then we're gonna be good. But
yeah, I mean, I'm working on the blueprint. It'll come out at some point, and
we'll solve the world.
Yeah, it'll solve all the problems. That'll be on the next Zoom call that we do. But
Can I ask a follow-up question though? So
yeah.
So you mentioned like they're not learning from what we're learning in these various other states. What are some pieces that, from your perspective, we have learned that should be implemented if a state is just starting out, that we know works or doesn't work?
Sure. So I think actually, on a positive note, the fact that states are more focused on including something around social equity in the initial regulations is a change. In just that, my opinion is very much that if you don't have social equity, however you define it, but to some degree in your very first regulations, you'll be very hard pressed to include that later. And so it's better to have something It will never be perfect, but it's better to have something that you can then expand and iterate on versus having nothing and being silent on it, because that is where a lot of places get in trouble, and it's hard, again, the kind of conflicting interests come into play. So even though I think New York totally got it wrong in how it was executed, I think the planning of it and the willingness to delay legalizing in order to make sure social equity was included was actually something that I do applaud them for. I just don't think that they had the right people around the table to execute it properly. Some of the other pieces I think is thinking around the learnings are around vertical integration or not. I think that you can have models of both of them, and then some of it is also around medical versus adult use, and is there a need for both of those markets versus you have a state like Washington which has now blended them together into one. uh, I'm not a strong advocate of one or the other because I'm still waiting for insurance to actually participate for the medical side, because I do believe that it is a true medical need. There are so many other complications that come with that, pharmaceuticals, all that kind of things. But I think that, if we're able to um, really starting to make it more like there is an adult use side and there's a true medical side that can follow a different path that can truly benefit patients and allow them access. I think we're starting to see that in some markets as well. And then you have some states like, Oklahoma, which it's just a free for all and everybody can have a license and do whatever you want. And I think that that will be fine for a moment in time, but they will also learn that it'll probably just be a race to the bottom. And so it's just like that delicate balance of how do you actually have businesses that can succeed versus opening it up so much for everybody that it's just a rush in and then nobody really wins. It's like, it's not an easy answer. I think it's impressive that Oklahoma was like, no barriers, like come one, come all. But then the challenge with that is that how do you compete when you can have a dispensary literally on every single block? So I do think there are some learnings that have come out of it, but it's just interesting. The intriguing part too, I think, is that culturally, every state is different. Parts of state are different as well, and so what they're prioritizing and what they think that they're going to value within that state is also a little bit different, which is where federal policy could be the unifying element.
I want to just touch back on the social equity. We're talking about it in the chat here. There seems to be growing cynicism around social equity. I had the same feelings as you when New York opened up. Somebody said in the chat, this is very money driven. Do you feel like there's nefarious players out there in this space on purpose, trying to make sure that social equity programs are not working?
I don't know if I would necessarily say nefarious, but more in that they couldn't care less if they do succeed. You'll see every multi-state operator now and most LPs, in Canada everybody had a DEI person at one point. They had, partnerships with brands. We've also seen in the more recent downturn that most of those people have been let go. That most of it's the first thing to get cut at any organization, because they kind of lump it in with, as a part of being like a critical need, it's more of like a marketing need or something like that. And I think when you start looking at social equity like marketing, that's when it's a real problem. That means that it's not a DNA of an organization. And I think that that's really what we've seen across the boards, is that when a push comes to shove, which it has multiple times in this industry, and we don't expect it to be the last, that is something that kind of gets shoved out until there's more capital, and then they'll bring it back. So it's a little bit of window dressing, in my opinion. But I do think that there is a growing understanding, and I see this a lot in New York, is that you're not going to have Black and brown people excited or loyal brand followers of a business that doesn't reflect who they are or where they've come from, or just isn't giving the respect that is deserved and needed. And then you see those same groups go back to the people who've been serving them for decades. And so it's trying to bring, and if you hold those people out of becoming in the legal market, the people will just go back to them. And that's the reality, is that, and that's how it should be. This is not just in cannabis, but broadly, and just like as consumers, people are much more conscious about where they're spending their dollars, where they're, who they're wanting to support, and they're being vocal about it. And I think what cannabis can really learn from is what's happening in the broader consumer market, because people are not, you can't get away with what you're used to. You can't get away with lack of detail. People are kind of double clicking into that. And then, as much as I think we probably are of a generation, or at least I know I'm, where I'm like, God, Gen Z, but I will give Gen Z credit for this stuff, and that they really care. And that is really important, because that's just going to keep continuing. And I don't think that cannabis can survive as just a mass market run by white guys at corporations. People will just go back to the illegal market. And quite frankly, I would support that, because those are the people they want to be supporting.
So what do we do? We're often asked as the cannabis industry to be the people who are making the change in this industry, but it turns out that anybody who's not, like a wealthy white entrepreneur, our stake in the industry is actually shrinking over time. We are, this is women, people of color, we're not getting bigger in this industry. A recent MJ BizCon report just showed. So we're asking the industry that's going the wrong way in this respect to help fix it. Are there steps that we can do? What can a person of color who wants to get into this industry, what are there practical things that you can give us to help us overcome what seems to be like this huge behemoth?
Yeah, and I think that, and I think this might be a little bit controversial, but I do think that getting into the organizations that are out there that are large, and learning and trying to be within those organizations and building and learning from within, and then trying to bring more people in, is a path. And then that's not saying that's like the only path, but it's not just about having it is very important to have people of color and women in the true executive and leadership positions, absolutely. But what I have seen is also so many people who start in all different kinds of positions, come, bring their skills from other industries in, and then they take that away, because then they have this kind of learning pedigree that they've done at a massive organization or something that's able to support a certain level of education, and then they go and do it themselves, and they build the teams that they want if they can't necessarily do it within those organizations. And I can say that for a lot of actually New York applicants, a lot of these people have worked at some, like the Curaleafs and the GTIs, and they're like, look, I got my training there. I can run a grow room. I can tell you exactly what was done right. I can do exactly what was done wrong, and I can go build it better. And my team is going to look this way, and I'm going to, serve these types of clients, and I want, like, this is what I want to support. And that's not like, that's one example, but it's something that I do think should be taken advantage of if you can learn with and from other organizations that are kind of, they're going to stand the test of time, for better or for worse, and then go and have that ability to do it again. And then, it's kind of like this odd pedigree. Like, you say that you spent 5 years at a facility at Curaleaf, then people, they'll pay attention. Investors will pay attention. It's kind of like the unfortunate way that, people also judge you based on your education. But so that's one element. The other thing is that I think I've seen, and again, I've been pretty impressed with in New York, is starting the organizations that have become, they're far more diverse, and they've banded together in this way to serve each other, and to become a growing voice to that then, like, the state is actually responding to. So they're at those council meetings, or at every meeting that you can imagine that's about cannabis, that are open to the public. They're trying to find people to place that as an organization. And, these aren't like super formal, but they're networks of people that are trying to lift each other up. And I've been just so impressed on like how they're helping each other. You know, it's not about the money, it's about how do we make sure that this massive group, and I'm talking like these end up being like hundreds of people, to make sure that we're not forgotten. And we can't forget the power of grassroots. Like at the same time, yes, I mean, I feel the same way where it's like, God, if I can't write a big check, how am I supposed to get a seat at the table? Um, and that was a part of the reason why we wanted to write the book too, is that like we have to get word out somehow and get ourselves a platform, so then we can give other people the platform. So it's like you have the ability to pass the mic, you have the ability to tell the stories and highlight this stuff, and hopefully that snowballs. It's kind of a vague, wishy-washy answer, but at the same time, it's like it's what we have to do in order to make sure that we can that this doesn't go and end up looking like every other industry that we have kind of grown tired of.
Tahira, I'm so disappointed. I thought you were going to come on this call and be like, okay, step one, step two, here's what states need to do. Everybody, let's go. But I really appreciate that. I like this like infiltrate and rise like mentality, like get in there, learn, and then go do it. Are there any resources that you like? You're saying there are these grassroots thing. Are there any more centralized resources that you know of that can help people who are trying to start out in places like New York and these markets that are currently unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even some of the more local organizations are trying to create opportunity in other locations. So in New York, there's an organization called On the Revel, which has done just an excellent job of not only bringing together Black, brown people and women and working with each other. So helping with on the brand side, like they've started kind of like these markets where it's only people who are part of that network and fit that criteria can then band together and go out. So I think that the replication of that, and the leaders of that organization too, are kind of all over the country, but they focused on New York because it was a new market. There's also there's a new council. I guess it's been around for about a year. The Cannabis Media Council. And so what that group is doing is really trying to focus on changing the image of cannabis more broadly, and with that bringing a lot more diversity into it. And you know that they're trying to do advertisements in like major magazines and publications and just things that are not the normal media, to show that cannabis is shifting and that image is shifting. You know, I think Women Grow still does a good job in different locations. I think chapters have changed a lot, but they do try to work to get more people in front of organizations. And then I think the other piece of it too is that there's, you know, at this stage, there are a lot of recruiting firms, a lot more than there used to be, but engaging with those organizations like banks or Flower Hire, you know, just groups like that that can also help those people have spent so much time understanding the landscape and kind of the who and the what and where the pieces fitting together. And I think what I've respected a lot about those organizations is they try to push out a lot of data as well on, here's where we're seeing, you know, more opportunity at different levels, and here's where we think we can help people get in. And they do care about diversifying the industry. Obviously they care about like serving their clients, which end up being businesses on one side, but the people are also their clients on the other side. And I think that those are not thought of as much as a tool to utilize for people who maybe aren't in that kind of, you know, white male demographic, but I found them to actually be really, really helpful.
Thank you for those practical steps. That does really help. I made a list. We'll put it underneath the YouTube video. This is where we could start. It does remind me of probably my favorite story in the book of um, everything's everything in cannabis is like it like you're just talking about being sneaky and tactical about getting in here. And I can't remember which state it was, but it was one of the first states to legalize. And in the book, you outlined how instead of asking for all of the things when they were legalizing, they asked for one small thing. And when I first read that, I was angry. I was like, why wouldn't you do all the things? And you explained that this is like we're creating wedges and cracks all over the place. And sometimes you just need like a little bit of water to seep in there to break it wide open. Can you talk more about that story? About that?
Yeah, and Yeah, I think one of them, there might be a couple, but one of them was an example of Illinois and the social equity program that was kind of evolving there, and it came down to different boards and property, and it really went tried what they tried to do is just focus on getting one person kind of placed into the right seat and being able to represent a community and then kind of expanding from there. The challenge that I think, and I know you guys were hoping that I would come in with a list of things. Now I feel bad that I don't have like a very solid blueprint. But I think what we try to do is we try to go in and have check all the boxes right away. And this is no different than everything else that's happening in the government. When you try to do that, nothing actually ends up getting done. So what's kind of a lower hanging fruit, which can give an entry point. And so in Illinois, it was the Evanston area where they were really focused on how do we make sure that we can just get, this an element around like the definition around social equity in there and make sure that we can have those people at least like represented in the legislation, as opposed to saying like they're going to have all these different rights and they're going to be at the front of the line and all of this kind of stuff. But if you at least started with that, then it gives them a foundational element of a starting place. And I think that that's kind of what I was saying earlier, is that if you don't have it included at the very beginning, it's hard to then add it in. But even if you have like one small bit in there, then that gives you that next step that you can keep building upon. Granted, it takes years, and that's the hard part, but that's just what happens with policy and the iterations of that. And if you don't have people who are necessarily the champions of it sitting in a seat for your Senate, Congress, your city council, you have to kind of wait for those terms to keep evolving. And so what they were focused on in Evanston is also making sure that that council person was very much aligned from the beginning, so they would be that voice continuing to iterate on it, and that the feedback would be taken in and not just discarded as a way of like getting votes. And that did actually make a difference, because then there was a seat at the table that they could actually continue to build upon. And it's still an evolving process. I think Illinois has come a pretty long way since when they started implementing their program, and was one of the ones as well that people were very excited about, and thought that it would be potentially like the blueprint that everybody else would use. And then unfortunately there always end up being elements around lawsuits, where one group will say that this was kind of unfairly written, and that's actually what's happened in New York as well, that people weren't expecting. If you ask lawyers, they're like, oh yeah, we totally expected this, but everybody else was like, oh, we didn't expect there to be these kinds of lawsuits. And what's happened more recently is that we had veterans sue the OCM, the Office of Cannabis Management in New York, because what they're saying what they did was discriminatory by putting certain social equity populations first and not veterans. And it's kind of like the surprising thing where you're like, well, we're all trying to help, but what they're actually saying isn't. Some would say to you that that's not technically wrong. So there are interesting nuances like that too, where if you try to include everybody, it's really hard. But then if you don't include everybody, other parties will feel like they've been discriminated against. And unfortunately, these are just the things we have to weather the storm of in order to make progress. And I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but there unfortunately have been too many people who've been impacted in a way that feel like they're going to be slighted if they're not included in a very descriptive way. In Canada, the initial policy for the country mentioned Indigenous people once, and that's it. That's something that's under review now, because they had to a 3-year review, but there is one mention of them, which is just pathetic. And but at least it was mentioned once, which I mean, I say that kind of jokingly, saying like at least, but those are the types of things that are now under review after more than 3 years of being legal, and hopefully changing along those fronts. But there's a pretty strong chance that nothing is going to happen on that side, because they're going to be trying to fix other elements of the policy as well.
Goodness. How do you wake up just like so frustrated every day? Like, do you go
I wake up in a
like how do
cold
you
sweat every
it's
night.
just like
But
there's
that's
someone,
fine.
it's unjust. Yeah. No, that's not my
Yeah.
actual question. My actual question, it's interesting to see, you know, there are questions coming in the chat like, what about my state? What about my state? And these states that aren't legal yet. I
Yeah.
currently live in a state that has, it's Washington, right? It's been around for a long time. And when I
Yeah.
moved here very recently, it was a shock to me that the system was so rigid. And they had
Hmm.
just passed another law making CBD that has any element of THC. It's supposed to be put inside of the dispensary system, making it even more in lockdown
Hmm.
in that current system. Is there anything that when you have a state that's already checked all of its boxes, so to speak, but they've gone about it in a way that has completely locked down that system, or if they're going in that direction, is there anything that we can do to turn the tides on that? Or is this one of those like, well, kind of get in the system and then figure it out? What do we do when it's already
Yeah, I
set in
think,
stone? Well, it feels set.
yeah, and I think that it feels set in stone, but it's not. I mean, Washington is it's an older state with what it has from policy, and there have been a lot of changes along the way. So I think that often the best way is to use, you know, a state like Colorado, which actually has like the most data coming from adult use and medical, to be able to challenge some of it. And I'm not up to date on, you know, how much Washington has kind of, how much more rigid they've become. But the other element that's coming into a lot of these much more experienced markets, these older markets, is hemp derived cannabinoids, and the complexity that that's throwing in, because when the FDA legalized, you know, when the Farm Bill passed in 2018, nobody thought about other cannabinoids coming out of hemp. And so that's throwing all the systems in, you know, kind of into whack. Um, and I think it could go a couple of different ways, but for a state like Washington, hemp derived cannabinoids actually put everything under threat, like the entire legal market in some way. And so in some way, for them to crack down more, or to make it that much more strict, is to be able to differentiate that these are, you know, developed within this very specific system where everything is tested, everything is licensed, we do it a very specific way. I'm not necessarily saying that that's the right way, but it's the way that they're trying to differentiate, because somehow whoever made these policies, nobody thought about the fact that there are other cannabinoids that can come out of hemp, and that one day somebody will figure out a loophole. And guess what? We don't have the language in our policy that actually addresses that. So now everybody, you've seen probably a ton of major brands shift to hemp derived cannabinoids and do e-commerce because they just want to take advantage. It could be a year, it could be 2 years, it might be longer than that, but that puts everything that's in, you know, the legal system, the license system, kind of under threat. So another surprise that we're dealing with, which is why the blueprint changes. You know, I'm like, oh, we have the idea, and then we're like, no, that's not going to work anymore. Um, so just on the like the making things more stringent, to some degree, I think there are important reasons to do it, and I lean more on the safety side for that, because until we have better information, it is hard to say, hey, don't worry about anything. You don't need any of this testing, all of that. And it's less about cannabis, but more what's going on, I think, just street drugs and things like that, that we want to make sure that there's safety, and not to impact our industry in the same way. On the other side, the more challenging you make it, the more you crack down on something, the more people want to make it illegal, and will start doing it themselves. Um, and so I think that there are safety concerns around it that are really important to factor in, but also, and this is why I get frustrated that more business people aren't in policy making, is that the more you make anything like too hard to get your hands on or have to pay too much tax on or anything, the more people are just going to go to an illegal market. And we have a very trusted and good illegal market. And you're seeing those come back to life in a way that nobody was expecting, because we've made things too strict. And I think that those are the types of things that Washington needs to pay attention to, because it's really easy to be an illegal cannabis producer now, and nobody would really know the difference because your product is just as good as what's in the stores.
Or so much better. Or so much better. Speaking as someone who currently is only purchasing Canadian government cannabis.
Yeah.
Woo, okay. All right, we should open up to chat, to the chat. Corinne, do we have questions in there?
We've had a few come in. Elizabeth said Pennsylvania has a pardon process that must happen before they can even consider expungement. Do you know of any other states with additional hurdles like that, like putting the as expungement? That there needs to be other things before.
No, not actually. I mean, Pennsylvania is kind of unique in having that process. On the other side, I think what we're seeing more of, which makes me hopeful, is that the use of things like AI to help go into a faster expungement process. So San Francisco is a great example of that. A couple of years ago, they utilized Code for America to create an AI tool that allowed them to expunge about 6,000 records within a couple of weeks. And the biggest challenge in every location becomes manpower, like because of the fact that a lot of these cases, a lot of these charges are not solely cannabis, but something intertwined with something else. And so the parsing out of that becomes much harder. But I'm actually really confident that we can use technology in a good way to be able to enhance some of that. But Pennsylvania is unique, I think, in doing that, and I'm a little surprised that they are, given the fact that a lot of states surrounding them are trying to just move faster towards expungement. But the challenge is that kind of falls to the bottom of the list when it comes to resources. So if anybody ever has ideas around that, like I'm always looking for them so we can suggest them to regulatory bodies to use more. And our hope is that when we're moving more towards federal policy, that's what will be unleashed for the states to actually utilize.
Thank you. I
So,
have two questions. One of
can
them
I,
is from Oh,
sorry,
yep. Yeah.
can I follow up on that? So I was the one who
Mm-hmm.
asked the question, and of course I came home and totally washed up and was already ready for bed early, and I was like, oh yeah, there's a Zoom later. So anyway, hi. So yeah, Pennsylvania, it's rough. I'm
Mm-hmm.
in the Philadelphia area, and I'd worked at a dispensary and was really trying to get the expungement clinic off the ground, but
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't even one to have because of that pardon process. So, and I don't want to take up time, focusing on just this state, because I recognize that AI is going to be super helpful. It kind of sounds like this is a problem that PA has created and that PA is going to have to get creative with.
PA has created a lot of interesting problems for itself.
Yeah, you can't buy beer and booze in the same store. You have to go to a liquor store for liquor. Like, that is the insanity of Pennsylvania in a nutshell.
Well, Pennsylvania is also, just on the cannabis level, has enforced a tool that has to be utilized, like if you're licensed. And most of the state of Pennsylvania, like most operators, absolutely hate it, but it's like mandated, and then they have to use other tools because that tool doesn't really work for them. So it's just, Pennsylvania has been interesting in just how it's decided to pursue some of it. But I'm happy to talk to you more offline, just about what's happening there and what you're experiencing, because I think it's going to be a massive market, and it already is, but I'm curious on why they're making some of the decisions that they are.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Tahira. Yeah, so there's some questions from down south as well. Everybody's kind of like, what's going to happen here? Why is my state weird? Cindy wants to know, do you think it's going to take the South longer because of the Bible Belt? Do you think that that's, I believe she's in Louisiana, and she's talking about the incarceration rates. What do you see in the forefront of legalization in the South?
I actually think it's going to move faster than we think. If you look at this point, how many states are legal with medical and adult use? I do think that if a state is not medical yet, it will always start with a medical market and then move into an adult use market. And I think that's particularly going to happen for the South. The truth of the matter is, and the reason why it becomes appealing to states that are much more right leaning, is tax revenue, is that there's an ability to capture that tax revenue. And although I'm not somebody who is going to sit there and be like, yay, taxes, if this helps get cannabis into the hands of people and like start the conversation around it, then I think it's a worthy effort. And it's good to be able to have something in a regulated market versus something that's going to be in a legal market. So I do think that there's probably a lot more conversation than you're seeing, because it kind of centers around the business side of it, and how do we, capture more for government. Like every state's in a deficit, right? So everybody needs new sources of revenue.
Awesome. Thank you. I feel like the whole thing has happened way faster than I thought it was going to happen.
Well, that's
Feels
great.
quick. Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
So
blink
Keith
your eyes
has,
and everybody's
yeah,
legal.
kind of feels like that. And like you said, then there's always like, and then now there's frankencannabinoids, or now there's that, you're just always like, whoa, I didn't see that one coming. That was quick.
Yeah.
It's like, how about some THCA weed delivered to
Yeah.
your doorstep? And you're like, what happened? What is this? So it is interesting. It's fun to be in an industry that's always changing. Keith wants to know about funding for social equity companies that already exist. He says, do you know about funding for current processors, cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and delivery?
Yeah, so most of it, I mean, there are still venture capital funds that are funding, or partnering across, and I'm happy to share a list back with Andrea and Corinne later on to share it with the group. I think a lot of the programs are on a state by state level, because of just if there are requirements around ownership. So I know I keep going back to New York, but New York has very specific requirements around, as an investor, what can you, like, how much can you actually be invested in, and what does that look like? And so that's why they tend to be more regional as opposed to national, because there are some of those ownership restrictions around them. And so there are groups that are still funding. The issue with social equity funding is the same as the entire industry for, call it, a year. Everybody's been kind of sitting back, as we've been going through a decline in the market. But I've been seeing a lot more conversation around that. And then also there have been a lot more grant makers at the state levels, that states are coming up with policies and coming up with pools of capital. Or if there are programs that exist, we should be looking into the programs that the tax revenues are going into, because a lot of them have set aside capital for business development of, different populations that are impacted. So depending on where you are, we can take a look into, like, what are those programs for the state.
Thank you. That's awesome. Just to conceptualize it and see where things are actually at. It is really interesting watching the states. You're like 50 different little countries down there, all doing your own things. So feels like that sometimes from up here with cannabis. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We are coming to the end of our Cannabis Book Club tonight. I do want to let you know that next month, and every time I tell Corinne this, she gets so excited. Corinne, next month, it's Cannabis and Spirituality with Stephen Gray. I know.
I'm
every
gonna
time.
lose my mind. I'm gonna lose my. I forgot, and then she tells me again. I'm so excited.
It's a really interesting book. I think it has like 13 different essays written by various people in the cannabis field talking about cannabis and spirituality, which is something that we haven't really touched on formally in this space. I'm really excited for that. If you got the emails to come to this, you'll get the emails to come to that as well. And Corinne, you want to tell them about this awesome thing that's happening in November that we're so excited about?
Yes, this book club is actually part of the Cannabis Wellness giveaway here in November. I don't know if any of you have already signed up for that. There's a link in the chat. You get points for doing certain cannabis wellness activities, like a cannabis meditation that we posted on Sunday, and cannabis education activities like this one. You all get an extra 20 points for being here and showing up live and sharing your questions and being here in community. You can win. Oh, I have it. Of course, I always have it right here, just always. You'll win Arden FX, or you can win a scholarship to the Cannabis Coaching Institute's Certified Cannabis Educator Program. It's a 12-week program that gives you everything you need to help others understand this plant and how it works. If you have any questions, let me know. That link is there. It's on Wake and Bake. You can just go to wakeandbake.co and scroll down. And when you sign up, there will be an optional entry for you to add your 20 bonus points for showing up here live. Super fun. We're gonna get way healthier with cannabis this month and geek out super hard. So we hope that you can join us for as many of these events as possible. And thank you so much, Tahira. If you haven't already, there's a link to this book in your email. Order it, read it. I read it to my daughter. I had to censor a little bit. I don't know if you know, this is a children's book. She is outraged. Richard Nixon is like enemy number one. She's like, wait, what did the hippies do? We're like in a hot tub having this conversation. I was like, this is a weird way to grow up, but thank you for that. I really, really appreciate you being so committed to sharing not only the history, but what we're learning as these states continue to legalize and attempt to incorporate social equity in a way that's meaningful. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I do want to apologize for not being more uplifting. I don't try to come and be like a Debbie Downer. But I think the point is that there is progress, but we need more people like you engaged, and everybody does matter. I think that that's kind of the highlight for me, is that we need more voices. We need more people around the table, and everybody does have an opportunity to get engaged. And I'm always happy to talk to anybody offline. You know, we spend a lot of time just studying the different markets and trying to understand what are the small ways we can splinter in to just make change. But also, this is like, we're in it for the long haul, and so look at the long lens too. And frustrations will be there, but in the end, we're hoping that it'll make a big difference. So I thank you all, and Corinne and Andrea, for having me on tonight.
All of Tahira's information will be on the replay on YouTube, but could you let us know right here how to find you if we wanted to reach out?
Yeah, LinkedIn, I'm pretty frequent on that, responding to messages. And then you can email me at tahira@highlandsvp.com, and we'll make sure that info is out there. But you can find me on either one of those, but LinkedIn's pretty easy too. I'm pretty responsive.
That's great. All right, everybody, unmute, say thank you. We hope to see you. We hope to see you soon, or maybe next month at book club. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Bye.